Alright, you guys, this episode of Yard Time, the federal series, is called Bloody Beaumont. The United States Federal Penitentiary Beaumont is a high security federal prison that's located in an unincorporated part of Jefferson County, Texas. The massive complex first opened up for business in 1998 and has a maximum housing capacity of anywhere between 1,320 to 1,350 inmates. Out of all the USPs across the nation, USP Beaumont is rumored to be one of the most violent and bloodiest federal prisons in existence. In fact, for this very reason, USP Beaumont is often referred to as Bloody Beaumont. This is a namesake that was affectionately attributed by the inmates because of the overwhelming number of stabbings, slashings, assaults, and killings that have taken place over the years. Located deep in southeast Texas, the federal correctional complex that Beaumont is made up of is a trio of federal prisons that are home to about 5,000 prisoners. These prisons are run by the Bureau of Prisons, which is the federal arm of the U.S. prison system, an agency controlled by the Department of Justice. The BOP oversees more than 150,000 prisoners, with almost 22,000 of them in the state of Texas alone. It is normally the failings of the private prison sectors that receives the most attention. But by taking a closer look at the federally managed Beaumont complex, a number of questions arose regarding the management of federal prisons, while also recognizing the inherent dignity of human beings and their potential for change. All prisons in the federal prison system are not equal. On one end of the spectrum, you have the club fed camps. This is where most of the non-violent white-collar offenders go, and this is why the prevailing notion is that federal prison is like a country club. This is a lucid description I've personally heard about some of the federal USPs several times over the years. You know the kind of federal prisons I'm talking about. Places you hear that offer resort-like activities such as yoga classes, tennis courts, no fences, and a bunch of non-violent white-collar offenders who are relatively spoiled. Make no mistake about it, it's still a prison. Nevertheless, it's relative comfort and relative freedom. Somewhere where it would be considered a luxury to do your time at. It's where they send guys like Mike, the Situation, from the Jersey Shore after he was convicted of tax fraud. A place where they send celebrities and former law enforcement officers who do their time without relative incident and who end up doing their time like model prisoners. There's almost no violence, similar to some of the fire camps in the state prisons. Most of the offenders are low-level types of guys who are trying to make it back home and who try to avoid getting into conflicts. Then there are the lower security prisons. They're a step up from the camps. These prisons are not as soft as the camps, however. They're often places where inmates who previously had high points end up at once their points have dropped. They call these overrides. After managing to stay trouble-free for a period of time, they'll get housed on these lower security yards. Although it's a break away from the yards that are inundated with gang politics and gang violence, they're still susceptible and prone to getting back into trouble. Nonetheless, they're still lower level. We'll just call them camp cupcakes. The next step up is medium security prisons. This is where things start to get real. These prisons are serious. They are constantly plagued with lockdowns and violence. Gangs and violent offenders are prevalent, and large-scale riots can pop off at any time, especially in the climate that the federal prisons are comprised of today. After the federal government seems to have exalted its wrath on targeting organized crime, prison gangs, and their street minions, there's been a huge influx of gangs into the federal prison system from the gang capital of the world, California. Over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, the feds have been relentless in going after the Nuestra Familia, the Mexican Mafia, and the Aryan Brotherhood organizations. Three criminal organizations that have been in constant pursuit of monetary gain and their ability at becoming self-sustaining and solvent. USPs across the nation are now littered and infested with the likes of these guys, and they have brought their nefarious political mindset with them. Most of these individuals are in the high security USPs such as ADX, Bloody Beaumont, USP Big Sandy, USP McCrary, USP Pola, etc., etc. The federal USPs make hardcore medium security prisons look like Holiday Inns and the camps look like Ritz-Carltons. A maximum security federal prison is designed to house the worst of the worst, a high concentration of the most violent, problematic, dangerous, incorrigible criminals in the nation. For perspective, state prison is a walk in the park compared to what the federal USPs have become right now today. Even some of the prisons that are considered to be some of the most violent and hardcore in California, places like San Quentin, Folsom, Pelican Bay, Corcoran, Tracy, Wasco, High Desert, Salinas Valley, or Chino. This is because a lot of the gangs and their leadership, the same ones who made California the kind of hardcore, cutthroat environment that it was, have all been shipped off to the federal prison system. That's where they're all at right now. Whether it was because of new rigid and stringent federal laws that targeted organized crime and criminal organizations, or whether it was because of overly zealous and highly motivated federal ADAs who specifically targeted prison gangs and their figureheads on the streets, the fact remains that most of these guys are now in the federal prison system. And this is a trend that's not only happening in California, it's happening all over across the nation. A lot of the prevalent big name gangs that you commonly hear about, gangs like the Latin Kings, Tango Blast, the United Blood Nation, MS-13, Nietas, the Nazi Lowriders, the Aryan Circle, the Triads, the Mexican Mafia, the Nuestra Familia, the Aryan Brotherhood, the DC Blacks, Folk Nation, the Crips, the Latin Disciples, the Almighty Vice Lords, Kumi, and the Gangster Disciples are literally just a few that have been targeted and commonly been mentioned in the media. We've all seen the articles and heard about the multiple RICO operations that the feds have continued to advertise all over the media. Indictment after indictment, it's always the same type of widespread investigations where multiple members all get taken down in massive, dragnet type of conspiracies. The only thing that changes is the faces. But it's this trend that's been changing the whole political landscape of the federal prison system and what type of hostile environment it's creating. As these huge RICO investigations continue to play out, the perpetrators just continue to be siphoned right into the federal prison system, case after case. The ADXs, the McCrearys, the Pollocks, the Big Sandys, and the Bloody Beaumonts are now the new Pelican Bays, the Corcorans, the Folsoms, the Tehachapis, the Salinas Valleys, and the High Deserts. The same way state-bound prisoners hear floating rumors about places like Pelican Bay being prisons where you don't want to end up at, is the same way federal-bound prisoners hear about some of the more violent USPs and how they don't want to end up there either. Places such as Bloody Beaumont, Big Sandy, Pollock, Marion, Leavenworth, McCreary, or ADX, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Since Beaumont opened in 1998, it's been the subject of mass reoccurring violence that's continued to give credence to the name that's been given by both those who live there and those who work there, Bloody Beaumont. Whether it was a stabbing, a slashing, a beating, a maiming, or a strangulation, Bloody Beaumont has continued to precede its name. The stabbing that you see reflected in the pictures being depicted were between a member of the DC Blacks, one of the biggest African American gangs in the federal prison system, and an Aryan Brotherhood member out of Kansas. This particular incident that was caught on one of Beaumont's security cameras was the type of bloody confrontations that became a common daily occurrence within the prison. This incident originally started after the DC Black walked up behind another inmate and gave him a Kool-Aid smile. A Kool-Aid smile is a term used to describe someone getting their throat sliced from ear to ear. Another Aryan Brotherhood member, the one you see in the pictures, seen the assault and came to his comrade's assistance. This led to both the DC Black and the AB member retrieving weapons and getting into a mutual knife fight. The two individuals ended up falling into one of the prison showers where the DC Black was fatally stabbed in the head. Other DC Blacks that were in the area swarmed in and used a broomstick to stop the assault before correctional staff eventually responded. Not even a year after the prison opened and started housing inmates there, one of the first killings took place on December 16, 1999. Two inmates, Arzell Gully and David Lee Jackson, apparently were involved in some type of conflict with another inmate by the name of Daryl Brown. Those that witnessed the incident claimed that the three guys were involved in what was described as a heated argument. As the argument escalated, both Gully and Jackson allegedly pulled out crude prison-made shanks and went after Brown. Unarmed and desperately attempting to avoid from being stabbed, Brown ran into one of the housing units where he was then cornered and trapped in a cell. This guy Brown wasn't a small guy, and although he attempted to fight off his attackers, he was still hit a total of 11 times. During the stabbing, one of the blades punctured Brown's lung, which resulted in him later dying. The shanks that these guys were using were what some would describe as bone crushers, a term used based on the fact that they were made of long pieces of steel flats, and usually because they have some nasty looking tips on them. Weapons like this penetrate human flesh like butter and crush any bone or internal organs that they may hit, thus qualifying the name bone crushers. After the stabbing, Gooley and Jackson were then subsequently both indicted for the murder of Brown in 2005 and sentenced to life. After this incident occurred, the violence in Beaumont continued to escalate and soon became an everyday part of the daily program. However, a year later, on January 5, 2001, another inmate by the name of Luther Plant was the 5th inmate to lose his life in Beaumont. Plant's murder, however, was much more controversial and was said to have involved rogue staff members who were staging gladiator type of fights between the inmates. The circumstances surrounding the murder was reminiscent of the type of staff corruption that had occurred previously hundreds of miles away in one of California's infamous state prisons known as Corcoran. Inmate Plant had been beaten and stomped to death by another inmate named Shannon Wayne Agofsky. Agofsky was an inmate who not only had a long history of violence, but he was someone who was also favored by several staff members who he had forged personal relationships with. Some of the staff members that worked in the housing unit where inmate Agofsky was housed developed a keen affinity and a deep sense of respect for him, based on the fact that he was an inmate who was known for his propensity and willingness to commit heinous acts of violence. In short order, they feared him. But this fear transcended into a level of respect that was afforded in different ways. Agofsky was given open, preferential treatment, and this was overtly obvious by the way certain staff interacted with him. Sometimes they simply just reverted to giving him small favors, like an occasional extra lunch, extra time in the shower, a cell move whenever he would be asked to move, or passing his contraband from one cell to another. This particular incident involving Agofsky is how Bloody Beaumont earned yet another one of its monikers that was affectionately afforded again by both its inmates and staff members alike, the Thunderdome. The Thunderdome is a moniker that was affectionately taken from the Mad Max fantasy flick of the 1980s, referring to the place where two go in and only one comes out alive. At USP Beaumont, witnesses that included both former staff members and inmates claimed that the guards paired up rival segregation prisoners in the 15 by 20 foot rec cages and forced the prisoners to go at it. This went unknown and garnered no attention until this match involving Agofsky and Plant turned fatal. On the day of the incident, Agofsky and Plant were placed in a rec cage together when, according to a Beaumont prisoner's testimony, Agofsky attacked Plant until he was beaten unconscious. Once Plant was knocked out, Agofsky then proceeded to stomp on Plant's head using the full weight of his body. The stomping continued until Plant's head was visibly crushed and flattened. Despite the critical state that Plant was in, he survived for 2 hours before he died due to the severity of his injuries. Forensic experts testified that inmate Plant drowned in his own blood and suffered excruciating pain while the stomping occurred. While BOP and FBI officials acknowledged that this was the 5th murder at USP Beaumont since it opened at that time, they refused to disclose any details to the media relating to 3 other homicides, such as the names, date, and time or manner of death of those men. The prosecution was able to seek the death penalty for Agofsky under a 1994 crime bill that made murder in federal prison a death penalty offense. Agofsky, who was already serving a life sentence without parole, was presented by the prosecution as an experienced and deadly karate expert, just waiting to demonstrate his deadly skills on anyone foolish enough to challenge him. Agofsky had a black belt in Hwa-Rang-Do, which is a branch of martial arts that literally translates into the flowering of manhood. A letter written by Agofsky himself was also presented at trial. He wrote, "All I do is work out, wait to leave, and hope the cops mess up and put me around some scumbag so I can test out my hands." The prison administration apparently gave him the opportunity he had been waiting for when he was put in the cage with his opponent, inmate Plant that day, who had served 8 of his 15 years on charges of arson. Multiple witnesses at trial apparently maintained that the pairing up of prisoners in cages and allowing them to fight was common practice, and that this was a well-known sport that was regularly being instituted within the prison at Beaumont. The next inmate to lose his life in Beaumont would occur a few years later on May 7, 2005. During this incident, inmates Marwin Mosley and Joseph Ebron entered the cell of another inmate named Keith Barnes. This was a planned attack, as these two individuals scripted the murder prior to carrying it out. As Ebron entered the cell, he rushed inmate Barnes and physically pinned him down so Mosley could perform some handy knife work on him. Mosley used an ice pick type of weapon to stab Barnes 106 times, killing him. The stab wounds were inflicted with precision, targeting all the main kill zones, such as the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, and most of the major arteries, thus maximizing the potential for imminent death. Barnes was incarcerated for murder and conspiracy to commit robbery. However, he became a target for Mosley and Ebron due to him cooperating against a co-defendant for a reduced sentence. Barnes wasn't aware of the fact that the court transcripts had already been disseminated, or that Mosley or Ebron were in possession of them. Mosley subsequently committed suicide in prison in 2006, and Ebron was charged with first-degree murder in the case and sentenced to death in 2009. During Ebron's trial, it came to light that there was a third inmate, Michael Beaumont, that was involved in the plot to kill Barnes. Beaumont apparently acted as a lookout during the homicide, and as a result was charged with second-degree murder and sentenced to 28 years in prison. Ebron is currently housed on death row at USP Terre Haute, while Beaumont is serving his sentence at USP Allenwood. On November 28, 2007, one of the first incidents involving multiple staff assaults occurred at the prison. This incident occurred while two correctional officers were escorting inmates Mark Snar and Edgar Garcia to their cells at the USP Beaumont complex. When they arrived at the housing unit, Snar and Garcia slipped from their restraints, repeatedly stabbed both of the correctional officers with prison-made bone crushers, and then took the officers' cell keys. Unfortunately for the officers, they ended up being collateral damage and weren't the intended targets, because in order to carry out their plan and get to their target, the officers had to be stabbed. After stabbing the officers, Snar and Garcia then unlocked the cell of Gabriel Rohn, their intended target, and stabbed Rohn over 50 times. Additional officers ended up responding and used chemical agents in an effort to stop the attack, but by then, inmate Rohn had already sustained life-threatening injuries. The wounded correctional officers and Rohn were then transported to a local hospital where Rohn was pronounced dead due to the severity of his injuries. The two officers were treated, and despite also suffering serious injuries, both officers survived. Attorneys for Snar and Garcia claimed that Rohn had repeatedly threatened to kill their clients and that prison officials had failed to respond to those threats. However, Snar and Garcia were subsequently convicted of murder, and both were sentenced to death on May 24, 2010. They are currently being held on death row at USP Terre Haute. By this time, USP Beaumont had already earned a fast-moving reputation as being one of the most violent USPs in the federal prison system. The level of violence and killings had been on an uphill swing since the prison had opened 10 years earlier, and at the pace it was on, it only looked like things would continue to exasperate. The trend continued on February 12, 2008, when USP Beaumont documented yet another killing. During a routine security check on one of the prison's ranges, a housing officer found the body of Ronald Joseph. Joseph was found in his cell unresponsive, lying on his bunk in what was described as being highly suspicious circumstances. Joseph looked as if he had been propped up in his bed with the covers tucked around his arms in an unorthodox manner. An autopsy later showed that Joseph died from asphyxia due to ligature strangulation or compression of the neck. He was basically strangled with some type of rope, ligature, or possibly even manually by hand. Later on, during the investigative part of the incident, two inmates, James Sweeney and Harry Lee Napper, were identified as being suspects in the murder. Information later surfaced that indicated that the murder was predicated on a gang hit that stemmed from Joseph violating the gang's internal policies. On May 4, 2011, Sweeney and Napper were subsequently indicted and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and second-degree murder. In 2012, Sweeney pleaded guilty to racketeering and murder charges for leading the prison gang Dead Man Incorporated in exchange for the murder being dismissed and was sentenced to life in prison. Napper received a decades-long sentence. Sweeney is now at USP Canaan and Napper is at USP McCreary. Beaumont has always been one of those federal prisons that's always been plagued by gangs since the prison first opened. Most of the killings that have occurred there were either gang-related, gang-motivated, or gang-perpetrated. Gangs aren't sent there by design because the administration has classified Beaumont as a gang hub, a place to send them so as to keep them all congregated and in one spot. It's probably more so because all USPs are high-security prisons, and this is the type of prison where they just end up landing. Over the years, there's been a lot of different gangs that have tried to assert their dominance over Beaumont and claim it as a stronghold. The Mexican Mafia, the DC Blacks, and a number of different Aryan-based white gangs. On May 3rd, 2014, one of those Aryan white supremacist-based gangs called Soldiers of Aryan Culture, SAC, decided it was a good time to make an example out of one of its own members for conduct unbecoming and for basically violating some of its own policies. One of the gang's longtime members, a guy by the name of Leo Johns, had apparently become way too complacent with regards to violating the gang's no drinking and no gambling policies, despite the fact that he had been warned several times about doing so in the past. Fellow SAC members Ricky Fackrell and Christopher Kramer discussed and weighed out John's potential punishment since they were both in leadership positions and since they were both basically responsible for enforcing the rules. After considering the options, they decided that Johns would serve as an example to the rest of the gang who continue to violate the rules and ethics despite being warned and despite being given the benefit of the doubt. Once they agreed on how they were going to deal with Johns, Fackrell and Kramer set their plan in motion by retrieving prison-made shanks and then ambushing him in one of the prison's blind spots. The term blind spot alludes to an area of concealment that's usually partially or completely obstructed from the view of the prison gun towers, the correctional officers, and sometimes even the other inmates themselves. The whole objective for stabbing someone in a blind spot is to avoid detection or to avoid being seen, so as to increase your chances of getting away with it without being caught. Fackrell and Kramer seen an opportunity to ambush Johns in an area that's called a sally port. It's a foyer type of passageway that leads in or out of a building. Unfortunately for Johns, he had been drinking Pruno all day, jailhouse wine, and was in no condition to protect himself or fight off his attackers. As they had planned, they waited until Johns entered one of the building's sally port areas before stabbing him nearly 24 times. After the stabbing, responding medical staff attempted to perform life-saving measures on Johns. However, his injuries were too severe and would ultimately end up dying at an outside hospital 2 hours later. Defense counsel for Fackrell claimed that Fackrell and Kramer only intended on assaulting Johns, but this obviously wasn't a viable defense. In the end, both of these guys were convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and sentenced to death in 2018. Just last year, an incident that occurred at USP Beaumont between the Mexican Mafia and MS-13 caused a nationwide lockdown of all USPs across the nation. This is an unprecedented effectuation that's rarely taken by the BOP. However, this just goes to show how serious they were taking this incident and that they were anticipating a massive retaliatory response by the Mexican Mafia. A Mexican Mafia member and a Sureño were both stabbed and killed by MS-13 behind a gang dispute that apparently escalated. Both of these organizations have hundreds of members throughout different USPs across the nation, and a war of this magnitude could have easily produced multiple killings. However, by enforcing this nationwide lockdown and moving the main perpetrators to different USPs, the BOP was able to avert the type of retribution that a lot of people were expecting. These killings that I have highlighted here aren't even a fraction of the violence and mayhem that continues to play out daily at Bloody Beaumont. This profile is just a small glimpse of what's been taking place at this federal USP located in an unincorporated part of Jefferson County, Texas. Prison is an unforgiving environment, an environment where life and death teeter on the brink of nefarious politics. The cornerstone of the prison system, whether it's federal or state, used to be predicated on rehabilitation, a place to right your wrongs and a place to atone for all the sins you have committed. Those of us who have been there, however, know that this is far from what prison is really about. At one point in time, this may have been true. It might have been a place where one could atone for all the dirt and destruction that most of us freely perpetuated. But if this were ever the case at one point in time, those days are long gone and in the past. Most of us are fascinated and intrigued by the daily perils of prison life because of the sheer level of violence. The stabbings, the slashings, the killings, how fast full-scale wars can pop off and how fast people can lose their lives. Life is precious, but in prison, the value of it is greatly diminished. Your last breath can be taken for something as senseless as looking at someone too aggressively, for bumping into someone without saying excuse me, for unintentionally violating someone's space, or for doing something that someone else perceives as a form of disrespect. Hopefully, most of you will be contained to hearing about the savagery of places like Beaumont through these types of stories on YouTube, and that you'll never have to walk a day in these troublesome environments yourself. I know that there's some of you who are part of that younger crowd that still seem to think that there's some glory in prison, and that prison credibility is something to relish about. Trust me, it's not. Meanwhile, the violence will undoubtedly continue as the BOP continues to cram more people into its system. Back in the day, people used to talk about federal prison as if it was the place to do your time. Again, they would talk about the tennis courts, the carpet in the units, and the resort-like atmosphere that some of these places were built like. That might have been true in the 80s and early 90s, but I promise you, nobody's talking about it like that these days, and federal prison is nothing like it used to be. The entire federal system is undergoing a facelift where the whole landscape is changing, adapting, and morphing into another system where California-style politics are taking hold. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Yard Time, the federal prison series. We have another series of Yard Time that will also be rolling out soon on the state prison system, so be looking for that in the very near future as well. In closing, we just want to continue extending our appreciation to you all for not only continuing to be loyal viewers, but also for just helping us grow and for always acknowledging that this channel is one of the few who have done it with integrity. With that said, we appreciate you, the viewers, as we realize that without you and your support, we would cease to exist.